That is one ugly motherfucker. What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you a card discussion on Appointer of the Red Lotus. This is a card that has seen very little play in the past, but is surprisingly actually making an appearance in the meta currently because of some of the unique aspects that this card benefits, especially at high tier competitive play. So before I get into it, I want to go ahead and let you guys know what this card does before we discuss why this card is as powerful as it is and why you might want to consider running it in the future. So Appointer of the Red Lotus is a normal trap card which reads, pay 2,000 life points and reveal all cards in your hand. Look at your opponent's hand and select one card, remove that card from play until the end phase of your opponent's next turn. So a couple things to clarify really quick, because this card is one of those cards that's a little bit old and has some outdated text. So, and it's weirded in a way that's kind of like anti-spell fragrance, where it kind of, you might on first glance not fully understand what it does. So I just want to clear a couple things up. So first off, when it says that remove that card from play until the end phase of your opponent's next turn, if you use Appointer of the Red Lotus during your opponent's turn, they're not going to get that card back until their next end phase, which is the end phase following the turn that they're currently on, meaning that that card is actually going to be removed for a solid 2 whole turns, which, as we know when it comes to competitive play, that can actually make all the difference, because by that point you're either going to have complete control of the board, that if they get the card back that's going to be returned from Appointer of the Red Lotus anyway, you're going to have complete control of the board and it's not going to matter what they're going to be getting back. Or the alternative, the game's already going to be fucking over, because that's usually what ends up happening anyway. The second thing I do want to clarify is, similar to a card like Mind Crush, this card does require you to have a minimum of 1 card in your hand to activate, because you can't just not show your opponent a hand. You do need to have a hand of some sort to be able to reveal, but it's only a minimum of 1 card, and we're going to discuss a little bit later why that's very beneficial. So let's move on. So there's a couple cards that come to mind that you might want to immediately compare this to. I already mentioned Mind Crush. Mind Crush is very similar because you're essentially removing a card out of your opponent's hand. Key differences, though, is that with Mind Crush, you already have to know what's in your opponent's hand. So typically with Mind Crush, you're going to be firing it off after they've used something like any sort of searcher card, or any type of card that might like reveal cards like Pot of Duality. Just any way that you already have some information about your opponent's hand, that's when you're going to flip the Mind Crush and rip the card from their hand. Appointer's different because Appointer actually allows you to look at their hand and rip the card out after you've gotten to see what your other options are and what else they're working with. It's also important to note that Appointer banishes rather than sending it to the graveyard. Now, Mind Crush can suck in that sense, because sometimes if you want to send something to the graveyard, that would be annoying. It might have a graveyard trigger, and then ultimately your Mind Crush was just pretty much wasted at that point, especially if it's something you really didn't want to hit the field, but it just happens to, have a graveyard utility purpose as well. Appointer's gonna banish it, and for the most part, there's pretty much nothing that gains any mutual benefit from being excluded in that sense. The other card that a lot of people are going to want to immediately compare this to is Trap Dustshoot. Now, Trap Dustshoot's a card we haven't seen essentially since GOAT format, and that's pretty much because Trap Dustshoot's fucking banned. And there's a reason Trap Dustshoot's banned, is because it's not only giving you free information of what's in your opponent's hand, but it's also ripping a monster card and shuffling it back into the deck. Now, again, there are some differences here, because Trap Dustshoot required your opponent to have a minimum of 4 cards in their hand to activate, and it was only limited to monster cards getting shuffled back into the deck. But if I told you that you could have a Trap Dustshoot that essentially could hit any card in your opponent's hand, didn't have a minimum hand requirement, and essentially did the exact same thing except almost better, I think you'd be very inclined and interested in that, especially if you're an older player like myself who played when Trap Dustshoot was legal. Oh, and by the way, this is at 3 copies as well. So there's a lot going on here, and it's really cool to see this making an appearance in the meta. So honestly, why is this card as good as it may seem? Well, the reason for that is because it's giving you the knowledge of what's in your opponent's opponent's hand. In my personal opinion, that's the primary purpose of why you play this card. Banishing it is really powerful as well, don't get me wrong, but the fact that you can look at your opponent's hand, analyze every card that they have, and essentially in your mind start to formulate how they're going to play out their turn, and then have in your mind, depending on your board state, the counters to the cards that they might use, you essentially can just pick out the one card in their hand that's the most problematic, or the card that essentially they're going to need to rely on the most if they want to have any chance of winning the game, and you can just banish it for 2 turns, and by that point, like I stated at the beginning of the video, you're either going to have complete control of the board because you remove that one resource for them at the beginning of the game, or you're already going to have won, and it's not going to matter the fact that it's going to be returning to their hand, because the game's going to be fucking over. So I want to talk about some decks and some instances as to why you might want to use this card. So let's take a look at pure ZOODIAC because, you know, we are still in a ZOODIAC True Draco-esh meta until we get the new ban list. So I want to give some examples that are meta relevant, but you can take these and extrapolate these examples to a myriad of different decks that we're going to be getting, especially once we're post-September ban list. So ZOODIAC, sometimes what happens with ZOODIAC is you only have one card in your hand that is what you need to get going, and the other 4 cards in your hand, or I guess 5 cards if you're going second, are sometimes just additional cards to help keep you going and not necessarily what you need to start. Like, you know, sometimes you're just looking for that one copy of Tenki or that one ZOODIAC monster or that Barrage or whatever it may be to really get things going. Well, if you get hit by Appointer of the Red Lotus and your opponent rips out that one starter card in your hand and you're just left with a hand of completely worthless cards like Shuffle Reborn and My Body is a Shield and just all this useless shit, then you're just fucked because then you can't even do anything on your turn. And it's even worse than that because not only did they rip the only card out of your hand that actually does something, but your opponent knows that every other card in your hand is fucking bullshit. So you can't even set your back row and try to bluff your opponent into thinking like, oh, I have a Solemn Strike, or I have a Solemn Warning, or a Torrential. It doesn't work because they know your hand's full of useless dead spell cards that aren't going to do anything, and they're just free to go off as much as they want, and you're just going to be paying for it because of the fact that they hit that one valuable card. Moving on to another deck like True Draco ZOODIAC or even True Draco in general, one of the biggest flaws of a deck like this is that it requires multiple pieces to function and come together. It's very much so on the other side of the spectrum as a deck like ZOODIAC that kind of just needs one card to get going. True Draco ZOODIAC or True Draco in general requires multiple pieces. And for instance, I'm talking about just any of the Tribute Summon monsters as well as the Tribute Summonable Spell and Trap cards as well. So let's say you're going up against a True Draco opponent and they're going to drop something like True Draco Heritage. They're going to activate Heritage in an attempt to to tribute summon one of their monsters. Well, in response, you can chain Appointer of the Red Lotus. Now you get a free look at their hand, and let's say they only have one monster in their hand. Well, you know that's what they're going to be tribute summoning because they don't have any other options, and you could choose to rip that out of their hand, and then they're not going to get to summon anything. Or, if that's not really a big deal to you, you can just choose to rip something else out of their hand entirely, and there's just so many different ways that you can go just picking apart the Draco ZOODIAC or just the pure True Draco player's hand in general that it's really going to dismantle their strategy and give them an incredibly hard time. The same logic applies to a deck like Dinosaur or Yang Zing Dinosaur, really any of the dinosaur variants in general. When your opponent activates something like True King Lithosogem, you can chain Red Lotus in response. You can either banish the Lithosogem out of their hand, or you can hit the card that they might be trying to destroy, aka the baby dinosaur, if they only have one, and then they're not going to get any value off the Lithosogem, and it's not going to essentially start all of their combo plays in order to help them progress and ultimately try to win because you just flat out stopped their most powerful play just due to one card. I really like what Appointer of the Red Lotus is capable of doing, and you know, a lot of people might say that, well, I have to give up 2,000 life points and I have to reveal my entire hand to my opponent. Well, frankly, 2,000 life points in this day and age isn't really a lot when we're paying 1,500 for Solemn Strike, 1,500 for My Body, 2,000 for Solemn Warning. We're paying like 4 to 5k for Soul Charge. Now I know that Soul Charge and Solemn Warning might not necessarily be in the same tier as a card like Appointer of the Red Lotus, but I kind of feel like that's comparing apples to oranges. These cards do very different things, but frankly, I would be happy paying 2,000 life points to rip a card out of my opponent's hand if it's going to win me the game, as much as, you know, playing a card like Solemn Warning and paying 2,000 life points to stop a normal summon because that's their only play for the turn. So in a way, even though they're different cards, they kind of fulfill a same role that ultimately gets you the same results that you're looking for. Now, to cheese the card and just to make it even better, what's so funny about it is that you can just set all the cards in your hand so that your opponent's not going to know what you have when you activate Appointer, since you do have to reveal your hand to your opponent. You can just show them one card in your hand because you do still have a hand, but then you might have everything else in your back row, and not only psychologically does that fuck with them because they know that if you're playing Appointer, you're going to be setting all of your spells in your back row anyway because you don't want to reveal any information you don't have to. But in addition to that, they could just fuck with them mentally because they might not realize that you have an entire back row of traps because maybe you happen to draw nothing but traps and that's what you end up setting anyway. They might just perceive that it's a bunch of spells because it's very similar to something like Elemental Hero Bubble Man. You have to set all your cards to special summon him, so a lot of the times you're not really playing anything that's much of a threat. So your opponent might think to go in, so you can use that psychological advantage to kind of have your opponent play into certain situations that you can capitalize on with some of your specific back row that's actually real back row and isn't just a bluff. Now, with every card I discuss, I do like to discuss the weaknesses as well, and Appointer is definitely a card that is, you know, full of weaknesses in its own right. So first off, it is a trap. Anytime I talk about a trap card, I have to mention that it is a trap because that means it's slow, that means it takes a turn to set up, and it could be another card that could essentially be doing something during your turn rather than a card you're having to wait to react to your opponent in order for them to do something first. Now, to be fair though, this is a card I feel like you're not going to want to main deck. I feel like this is a card that when you're going first in your games 2 or 3, you're going to want to side this in because that's when it's at its best, and I feel like that's where you're going to be able to capitalize, not only in terms of being able to hit the best card out of their hand, but also in terms of maximizing the amount of advantage you're going to acquire just from seeing their hand and being able to know how to play and counterplay around specific plays that your opponent might do based on the cards in their hand. So you're really not going to want to have this in going second because by that point your opponent's going to be established and you're going to know a majority of what they have anyway. But going first, this card plays a very valuable role that we haven't really seen a card do in a very long time. But ultimately, guys, those are just my opinions on the card. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Appointer of the Red Lotus. If this is a card that interests you in possibly playing, whether in your side deck or if you're feeling really ballsy in your main deck, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time. 1, 2, 3.